if you have not watched previous webinars, if this is your first one, welcome. But you can watch the older webinars if you're a Connect member through the Pro Tips section of your page. When you log in now, you have a really cool dashboard. That's everything is right there. You can click on Pro Tips. There are a couple places where you can click on that, and it'll take you to be able to view all of the videos that we have. And we have a ton. There are going to be a lot more coming. Anyway, we'll just kind of get started here. So this is a topic that I haven't covered specifically as far as only discussing brainstorming and development exercises. So I'm kind of pulling a few, not every single one of them, but a few from the online coursework that I have. And we're going to be talking about various ways to develop concept and character. I'm really not going to get into structure all that much because, well, I'll explain when we get there. But as a little primer, if you want to call it a primer, I've already mentioned the new website. Hopefully you are all enjoying this. If you have questions, you can reach out to customer support. I think it's support@networkisa.org. I have been hosting kind of quietly under the radar some live retreats here in Wisconsin, screenwriting retreats with a number of writers. Last year we had a total of 14. This year we had 12. And I host them in this big, beautiful house near the lake where I currently live. And they've been so much fun and so helpful. And all the writers just have a great time. And I'm going to be doing a lot more of them next year, hopefully culminating in a very big festival retreat near the end of next year in October. So if you have questions about that, how to, see, and Ryan Fukuda, he's in the chat here. He said, they are fun, highly recommend. Ryan attended the recent one. They're really fun. And if you have questions about it, or if you just kind of want to stick, your name on a mailing list, so-called, you can email me and I'll keep you updated on the retreats I'm going to be posting next year. Yeah, where are they held? They're held in Wisconsin, southeastern part, about an hour and a half north of Chicago, about a less than an hour drive from the Milwaukee airport. Not that difficult to get to. Some retreats are like, oh my God, Jen Grisanti just hosted a safari, like an African safari screenwriting retreat. People said it was amazing, which I'm sure it was. And Jen is awesome. But that seems like daunting to me, like, holy cow, I think I just kind of want to get some writing in, but I'm going to go on a safari. So no, it's pretty simple. A lot of open writing time available to the people that attend. Linda, yeah, my friend Noreen just went and loved it. Yes, Noreen's great. How has your screenwriting changed from the retreat you attended in Wisconsin? That's a good question. And Ryan, you can answer that. But I'm going to be hosting more of those in the coming year. So you can email me, max@thestoryfarm.org, if you want more info. I'm also expanding my writing groups as of January. I'm going to turn them a little bit more into workshops. They had previously been a little bit more lecture-oriented, kind of accountability with light workshopping. I'm going to flip it a little bit. It's still only $50 a month. We meet twice a month, or, well, every other week. Sometimes it happens more than just twice. But that'll be happening as of January. I think the second week of January is when we're starting. So if you want to be included in that, there's no prerequisite. You can just join. It's either Thursday evening or Friday morning. You can email me, and I'd like to get as many writers in there as possible. So hit me up if you're interested in the writing groups. And of course, as always, I have space available in the one-on-one consulting and coaching if you wanted to work directly with me just over the phone. Okay, so yeah, development and brainstorming exercises. So I have a whole bunch of notes here that I'm going to go over. I'll probably and eventually share my screen and give you a little bit of a view into some of this list making that I've done, mainly with character attributes, just one-word descriptors. We'll get to that in a second. But for those of you who have taken the online course that I have, the craft course, you can go to thecraftcourse.com if you're curious. But in the first week, I covered this little exercise called voice pressure points. I've covered it in webinars in the past. It's been a little while since I've covered voice pressure points. But it's the only real journaling I have my writers do in terms of their exercises and development. But voice pressure points are basically taking a look at your past and finding two moments in the past that changed your world perspective in a positive way, and two moments in your life that changed your perspective on the world in a negative way. Or at least you think, looking back, that changed me in some way. This moment really changed me. The example I give in the coursework for me is when I was told that by my dad, who I have a great relationship with, but he said, I'm never going to be a professional baseball player. I could go into the long story. A lot of you have probably already heard it. I don't need to go into the details, but that was a moment that changed my outlook and perspective. Prior to that moment, I didn't really have any doubt. I was like, yes, of course, I'm going to be a professional baseball player. I think I was 11 years old. And then suddenly I hear from my dad, kind of, in his own way that he probably could have said differently, giving me a little bit of a, truth hammer and a reality check. He could have said it differently. I was actually a pretty good baseball player, but nonetheless, it instilled doubt in my life. And from there, I if I were to look back at especially moments through high school and into a little bit of college, I hesitated a lot, and it can kind of be tracked back to this kind of installation of doubt in my life. And so that was a little bit of a pressure point for me, because also when I'm writing my own stories, I created this little exercise because I was looking back at all the characters that I had written in multiple, various stories. And they all kind of shared this same element of like a hopeless dreamer in different ways. They were all striving for something that they never really believed that they could be. And it wasn't necessarily a conscious decision I was making when I was developing those characters. Had I gone through these voice pressure points, I probably could have gone through the character development of those characters a little bit faster, dug a little bit deeper, knowing this, this was a piece of me that I was putting into this character. So that is what a voice pressure point is. It's looking back. And if you can't come up with 4 different, moments, even if it's just 1 or 2, and whether it's truly traumatic, hopefully it wasn't, or just something you'll never forget, like from this point on, whether it's a literal moment or a series of moments, my life changed, and here's how it changed in terms of my perspective, how I looked at the world. That's the emphasis. And as an example, I was interviewing, and I've told this story before. I was interviewing on a podcast years ago, 2 writers who wrote for Bob's Burgers. One of the writers was a twin. He was raised as a twin, and not raised as, but he had a twin brother. and so they had, almost identical experiences growing up. They were always together. They were very close, same age. They did everything together, et cetera. Their parents fought all the time. Thankfully, it wasn't an abusive relationship, but they argued constantly to the point of, sometimes it getting a little out of control. And one of the brothers, the writer that I was interviewing, looked at it almost in a self-defense kind of way, comedically. He had to look at their arguing as just, oh my gosh, this is silly and ridiculous. I'm going to try to bring comedy to this as a way to cope. His brother, though, who had the same exact experiences, looked at it much differently, and he was affected negatively by it. He was really, like I said, negatively affected by his parents arguing this way. They were having the same exact experience, but with very different perspectives. And so, there's a much longer story there that I could go into, but it's one way of looking at how our life experiences truly do define not only our outlook and perspective and, how we perceive the world around us, but as writers and creatives, how we then develop from that place. How do we develop stories that we're going to tell, the themes that we want to make sure the audience, feels and understands, so on and so forth. And having a very real understanding of who you are as a person is so essential when we're working in the creative field. You really need to understand what your take on life is. Your perspective is your voice. And if you look at any comedian, it's their own personal point of view that ultimately defines not just how they deliver the joke, but what jokes they're going to tell. And so if you're going to be, just as an example, if you want to write a horror movie, what aspect of your personal identity and voice will help define the overall tone of your story? How is it going to direct the actions and reactions of the character? Does your voice help define what that goal might be in your horror story, whatever that main character has as far as their pursuit? Most horror stories have some level of just, survive, don't die. But there might be other, not only levels of the goal, but reasons for accomplishing this goal. That's when you can dig into yourself. So this first exercise, anytime you're trying to develop a new idea, try to go here first to the personal story. your own personal story, your own personal perspective. So that you can put a piece of yourself into the story. Like if I were to write a horror movie for myself, it would definitely be a horror comedy. That's just because I know that about myself. I know that one of my flaws is that I have to bring comedy into a dark or emotional situation. You know, in a way, and I wrote down in my notes, I'm kind of like a dumbed down version of Chandler from Friends. I'm not as funny as Chandler, but otherwise, like if I don't, I feel as if I'm going to make myself way too vulnerable and then feel like I'm kind of losing myself in a way within that really emotional situation. This is slightly exaggerated, you know, but it's exaggerated for purposes of telling a story. But, you know, it's important to note because it directs my choices for all of the story elements, including dialogue, for any story I'm going to tell. I'm not Rob Zombie. You know, I'm never going to be Rob Zombie, and that's totally fine. I'm not going to try to write a horror movie just so that I'm like Mike Flanagan, who did, you know, Haunting of Hill House, Haunting of Bly Manor. I might lean a little bit closer to a Mike Flanagan because some of his themes and messages, the emotional, you know, impact of the story is a little bit closer to who I am. But I would probably go along the lines of like a Tucker and Dale versus Evil. If you haven't seen Tucker and Dale versus Evil, by the way, if you like horror and you like horror comedy, it's by far my favorite. Tucker and Dale versus Evil is just so great. And it has so many social and cultural themes and messages that are coming through it. But anyway, looking at this, kind of coming from a place of still, you know, personal story development in a way. If I were to, and I'm going to get into more of this as we go, but if I were to write out my own flaws, even if they're going to be exaggerated, but, you know, again, just for story purposes, this is what I would say. And I'm going to write this, I'm going to put this in the chat box so you can read with me. This is by no means perfect, but it gives you a sense of what you can do with defining yourself a little bit through your own flaws. Romantically hopeless, which, you know, it speaks for itself. People-pleasing know-it-all with empathy and compassion, and a far too practical approach to life while constantly trying to pull my head from the clouds. So, and this, it's kind of, you know, I shouldn't say just the tip of the iceberg, but that's, you know, there are elements to that that are very true. I'm exaggerating just to kind of, you know, get a point across, but I'm a conundrum. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one dealing with conundrums. We all have positive and negative faults. I have heard of the Myers-Briggs type. I love taking those tests just to kind of dig a little bit deeper into who you might be. Tony mentioned this in the comment section, but yeah, so I'm a conundrum and I'm not the only one, but you know, you can jump from that little flaw list. It really is just kind of a list. It's a long run-on sentence, but you can jump right to brainstorming specific moments and scenes that will show us, the audience, these various flaws being confronted within various situations. And so I'm going to get into a lot more of that with a whole list of different words that I've kind of kept over time, but then, you know, we'll get more into that. But I think the reason I like starting with this idea is because it's such an important exercise that we just don't do enough of. We don't ask the question, what are my own personal flaws and set of personal flaws? You know, so what holds you back in your own life, you know, taking you separately, you know, to separate yourself from your story development, but what holds you back? What are you personally afraid of? What causes your current flaws? In other words, did something happen in your past? You know, again, a reference to your voice pressure point that caused these flaws. A lot of flaws when we're developing characters are really just surface level stuff. It's kind of what the outward world sees of our characters. You know, as an example, if someone is an alcoholic, sure, that's a flaw, and it will direct various ways the character is going to act and react within scenes. But what caused the alcoholism? That really is the deeper issue. Jen Grisanti calls it the wound. You know, there is a difference in some ways between the surface level flaw and the deeper wound. The deeper wound is going to end up being what needs to be confronted by the end of the story. But it's all, you know, it's all connected. But diving into these questions, you know, what's your own personal flaw or set of flaws? You can't lie to yourself. You're not going to be presenting this to anybody. You know, it's not like this is a pitch or something. You're not asking for anybody to approve of these flaws. This is for your own work. And so you can't lie to yourself. So digging in, you know, deep as far as your own personal issues, it's going to help illuminate the types of stories you want to tell and why you want to tell them. We all tell these stories that we want to tell, that we have developed in our brains or even on the page, because there's a piece of us in each of these stories. So that question then, what piece of you will this particular story, whichever one you're working on, present to the world? You're presenting yourself to the world. You may not be, like the sentence that I wrote, I may not be having all of those flaws in one character. You can take pieces of it. And that's a way to connect to the character. Even if, like, for instance, the book that I wrote, the young adult fantasy adventure about a 16-year-old female fairy with shredded wings. So basically, I was writing about a disabled 16-year-old girl. I am none of those things. So how do I connect to that character? It's by finding some kind of universal connection, not only between me and the character, but also what the audience can connect to. Because, no one, quite literally, is a 5-inch tall fairy, much less one with shredded wings. So there are things that keep us disconnected, but there are a lot more things that can connect us to that character. So you really have to go into that deep personal story stuff, voice pressure points. What are my flaws? How do these flaws dictate the types of stories that I write? Can I look at past scripts and consider, the hard question, am I not digging deep enough? Am I not being personal enough? Am I not sharing enough of myself in this draft? Sometimes you are writing, these high concept kind of science fiction fantasy projects that, you may not have this huge theme you're trying to present, and that's totally fine. But there are going to be pieces of the main character or side characters that will have pieces of you in it. And that's just going to draw the audience in that much more. People pleasing is a flaw. It certainly is, Eliza. Okay, so we'll go into some practical story development brainstorm exercises. And just as a reminder, brainstorm exercises, regardless of which one, they really only need to be asking questions and making lists. We don't need to overthink this. There's no magic little formula brainstorm exercise that's going to be like, oh my God, this is perfect. It's a plug and play, paint by numbers. Sadly, it doesn't exist that way. Most of these are just list making. And I love making lists. Like, my life is revolved around making lists, just because I have about 7 different jobs. But okay, so basic conceptual development. A lot of what we just talked about helps keep you in that conceptual development. But here's some just basic questions, okay? What's the plot goal? What's the main character's personal goal? How do they differ? And like I mentioned in the parentheses here, you may not know either of these at the outset, but if you choose and define one of them, you should be able to see what the other goal might be. And again, like I'm saying in the notes here, emphasis on might, because we have to be okay with not being right away. When we're developing an idea, you're just throwing things at the wall. What's the plot goal versus the personal goal? So, and as an example, I use National Treasure as an example, probably far too much, but most of us have seen it. Most of us know the basic idea. It's just for educational purposes. Really basic story, not presenting huge themes, universal truths or anything, but there is still pretty obvious things as far as a goal is concerned. Plot goal, find the treasure. There's a map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. Get the map, find where the treasure is. That's a plot goal. There are little goals in between, all these different bigger goals where they have to get out of this situation. They have to stop this guy from, that's just basic structural plot beats. But the emotional goal, Nicolas Cage's character wants to prove his family's name is worth it, for lack of a better way of saying it. So there's a personal issue here. He wants to be proven not just correct, but redeemed. There's a redemption story in there. That's as far as you technically need to go at the outset of creating a new story. You have to dig in. Okay, I have this basic plot goal. Maybe it's this, find the treasure. What does the character want personally? And then how do they connect? Really easy. Another question for staying in conceptual development. We don't ask this question or stay in this spot long enough, I don't think. What's the genre? But what types of visuals are necessary in this genre? What types of feelings and emotions are necessary? Yeah, what types of emotions and feelings not only does the genre promise in some ways, but that I want to get across personally. And then on top of that, have you studied this genre? How many movies or shows have you seen in this genre? For some of you, it may be really easy. You could be a huge horror fan. I'm staying on horror just because Halloween's, less than a week away. And if that's the case, great. Restudy those movies. Pay attention to every facet: concept, character development, structure, the time stamping of when things happen, the general expectation of when the scares come, what usually happens at the 50-minute mark, what usually happens at the end. Horror is one of those things that you can kind of copy and do the same way. But then if you find ways to flip it, change it up a little bit, suddenly we have something unique. But you really have to study your genre. You have to be a total geek and just watch the genre you're writing in. Otherwise, you may end up writing a movie that's already been done, or you're copying it too much, and suddenly the script turns into a little bit of a cliche. A lot of these things. Watch interviews with directors or writers that write and direct in this genre. Really be a nerd in that genre. Kind of along the same lines, is my project unique? What similar projects have previously been produced? How is my idea different? And what elements of my idea make it different? Basic questions, everybody. This is not some magical little formula. The next one that I'll hit is a little bit of a formula. So we might all like this, because I know all of us writers like these very practical kind of puzzle piece exercises. So I call this 4 quadrants development. That has nothing to do with audience. You hear that, the 4-quadrant movie where you're hitting all ages, boys and girls, men and women. That's what a 4-quadrant film is, where you're hitting, all 4 quadrants of the demographics out there in the world. Anybody could see this movie and enjoy it. That's not what I mean. 4 quadrants development. So if you picture a box, square box, line down the middle, line across, so you have 4 squares in the box. There are 4 quadrants of the bigger square. And if you put in one square, actually, we'll do it differently. We'll put all 4 in the boxes, like main character and flaw, upper left, doesn't matter where you put them. Second act, situation or story, upper right. Secondary character or the opponent motive, you have a choice here, in the bottom left. Theme and genre, bottom right. If you choose one box, pull that out and just develop that one. What's my main character and flaw? You do a ton of backstory work. You work through the personal issues the character's having. You do all of that character work, and I'll go into some of the flaw stuff in a moment. But let's say you just spend time doing that. From there, you then look at, well, what might be a type of situation, the second act story, that I can place this type of character in. And I've mentioned that in so many webinars. That's kind of my so magical formula, if you will, but it's really basic. Type of character and a type of situation. You could jump right to second act situation and story and go, well, what type of situation can I place this flawed character within so that that flaw is confronted and it's difficult and this character is constantly challenged. There's conflict along the way. This is if you have a brand new idea and you're just trying to throw things at the wall. You could technically do this with a finished script in the same way. If you know what your second act situation is, you can be asking the question, is this situation conflicting enough from a personal emotional flaw basis? Is the situation that my character is in, the pursuit that they're on, the goal that they're trying to achieve, does that test the character enough? And so it goes for the same with the other boxes. Let's say you know your theme and your genre. You want to have use some level of love conquers all, but hopefully something a little bit more specific within the horror genre. I'm going to use horror again. You can then go, well, what type of character would fit this? Well, probably me, from what my flaw was saying, romantically hopeless, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. And now it's like, okay, well, I have that character and I have a genre. Who might the secondary character be? Who's going to go along the ride? Who's going to be the Samwise to Frodo kind of character within a situation I haven't even figured out yet. It's okay if I don't know that situation. Let's just develop the secondary character from the same level you did for your main character. Flaws, desires, wants, needs. This is a big one I didn't add in my want versus need. I didn't put that in my notes, but you want to be considering that for your main character and your secondary character. They want something, but they actually need something. The secondary character won't go through as much of an arc usually, and I'm kind of speaking a little bit more from a feature standpoint. But nonetheless, the main character thinks they want something, but they actually needed this. They had to realize this. They had to discover this, all those passive words. So hopefully you understand what I'm saying here with these 4 quadrants. You just kind of put them in a box. Let's just choose one of them. Let's develop the hell out of that one. I tend to start with either second act situation or main character and flaw. I think that's the natural progression of how, our creative brains work. We're usually starting with a character, or we're usually starting with some kind of a plot situation. And then you just look at those 4 quadrants. Let's develop those. And eventually you're going to get to a place where you can see moments and see scenes that happen because of those development processes. Yeah, so just looking at as another little example here. So consider what the others would need to be as a reaction to the one you've brainstormed. So as an example, main character flaw is tight-gripped, rigid, unable to let go of anything, control freak. A second act situation could be that his son is kidnapped and he's the only one who can find him, but he has to swim the entire unknown ocean to do it. Talking about Finding Nemo, obviously. The theme is then along the lines of let go and let life lead you where it's supposed to lead you. Maybe you can get a little bit deeper there. Who then would be the perfect secondary character of that type of main character? Dory, someone who lets go and literally forgets everything every 10 minutes. So if you ever want to try to find a nice plug and play, paint by numbers approach to storytelling, watch any Pixar movie. They change things up a little bit with WALL-E and Inside Out, and they go, they expand things a little bit. But anyway, hopefully we kind of get a feel for what this 4 quadrant approach might be. This is either early development project brainstorming or testing a project you already have done. Looking at flaw, this I think is a big one. Like when it really clicked in my head as to how I should be looking at character development, I realized that it isn't just character development that I'm brainstorming. Character development is directly tied to structure and the page work. Concept as well, of course, but because the characters define the concept define the characters. But when we're looking at flaw, you could, in a very basic way, just consider the opposite of what you've brainstormed. If you're, and this goes for some of the other 4 quadrants as well. If the second act situation is going to be, let's say, a road trip hunt through Europe for the dangerous werewolf king, then who might the best characters be that should be placed within that type of situation based on your genre? That may not be a direct correlation to opposite, but it is a little bit of an opposites attract kind of thing. If you want to write a comedy adventure, what type of character within that genre would be best suited for entertainment purposes to go hunt down the werewolf king? I don't know, king right off the top of my head, but that's where I'm going in terms of these 4 quadrants. So going back to the flaw listing, the character development, like I was saying, when I realized that character development is more than just backstory stuff, it's actually preparing you to write the story, literally write the scenes and moments. I was like, okay, wow. So I have this long list of words that are descriptors for characters, and it's really just scratching the surface. But we can use these to not only to help define our character types, but to help see moments and scenes because of the descriptors. So I'll share my screen here and you can see some of these words. And again, some of them are really not all that intriguing, but you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about here. So yeah, attributes, word choice, flaw development. And I'm noting sweet and sour, light versus dark. That's something that we all have to consider when looking at flaws. A flaw does not always have to be just bad or just negative. A flaw can be something that just makes someone's life a little bit harder, but there are positive elements to it sometimes. So, and then also you want to consider what their profession or life stage might be. So I wrote down some examples of how I try to really whittle down my character descriptor, if you will, trying to come from a place of flaw reference. So a gullibly courageous plumber. I made these up right before the webinar. Believe me, these are not perfect, but you get a sense of who this person is. A charmingly lazy mouse, an eagerly ambitious football coach, or like Shay, my main character in my young adult fantasy book, a blindly ambitious 16-year-old shredded winged fairy, a brilliantly mischievous freshman in high school. What this does is it immediately allows our brain to, we can quite literally copy and paste that, put it into a different pages or Word document, and just start listing scenes and moments that show that. When I, like, it was drilled into my brain when I was going through a lot of my, masterclass stuff and screenwriting and college and everything, that you take your flaw and you make a list of moments and scenes that show us that flaw, that show us this character confronting this type of personality, this type, this person, whoever this person is. It's just a list of moments that are going to show this. Emphasis on the word show, not just dialogue, not just back and forth discussions, not information or flashbacks or whatever, a literal scene and moment that is going to show us this character being a brilliantly mischievous freshman in high school. More specifically, you then come from a conflict place. What does brilliantly mischievous and freshman do? What could that provide in terms of drama or I keep using the word conflict, the problems that can come from that. And as an example, and I use this, I'll scroll down a little bit, you can see some more of the words that I have written down here, and I'll get to just some more examples here. But as an example, with my comedy adventure script that never went anywhere, it needs a rewrite. I think it's marketable, but everybody thinks their script is marketable. It hasn't gone anywhere. So I use it as an example in my teachings. But I have this romantically hopeless history nerd going on, and he's extremely risk averse, going on an extreme sports contest tour through Europe in order to find the fabled sword Excalibur. That's character meeting plot situation. So it's a type of character and a type of situation. And that was my very early brainstorming. That was almost all I had. It's because I put myself in an exaggerated form within the character. And I thought, what if I put myself into situations I do not want to be in? Parachuting from a plane, whitewater river rafting, jousting with these huge Nerf jousts, 3 stories up on some ladder, all these ridiculous things that are going to test me being risk averse, all the different things that are going to test me, terrified of being vulnerable, especially with, being romantically hopeless, all of these flaws. I would just list all the different moments. And so that's part of this moment listing exercise, moment listing, where it's really simple. So you've got, picture like a page of like a Word document here, and down the middle, you just draw a line. On the left side, try to come up with 50 moments or scenes that show, we'll say this, or this, whatever, that show this flaw coming out in a good way or a bad way. The flaw working for the character, the flaw not working for the character, the character being faced with their flaw. Try to come up with 50 scenes and moments, even if they have nothing to do with your story. Because in some places where we're developing story, we don't even know what the story is yet. We're just on character. So you're just trying to figure out who this person is going to be. On the right side of the page, it's windows. It's a list of 50 different ways to show who this character is just through a visual, just through set decoration, type bedside clock on their nightstand, the shoes they wear, the clothes on their body, the cars they drive, the posters on the wall, whatever it might be. List as many of those things as you can think of. And suddenly you've got this list of non-verbal cues and visuals into who this person is, but also you start to see a story form, especially if you've already, kind of figured out what your plot situation is. Then you can just start placing that character into various elements of what that plot is, but you're not even remotely worried about structure. You're not concerned about what happens when, how many pages do I have, what kind of scene headings am I writing? None of that matters. It's just making a list of all these different moments, scenes. So in terms of this little document here, there are so many different words. It's just one word, but if you combine some of these, kind of like what I did up here, charming and lazy, what might someone who is both charming and lazy look like? I just went to mouse, whatever. It doesn't really matter. This could be charmingly lazy, house husband, whatever it is. But you're trying to combine a sweet and a sour. Charming is a positive thing, but when they're also kind of lazy, well, suddenly this is really flawed. That person might even turn into being a little manipulative, kind of having other people do things for them because they're lazy, but they're really good at convincing other people to do things. I think you can see where I'm going with all of this. So it's just taking a couple words, resourceful yet selfish, creative yet conceited, and just, it's a pick and choose kind of thing. But it's also, if you already know who your character is, and this goes for TV or features, if you already know who your character is, you want to try to drill down your flaw reference into 2, 3, 4 words, because eventually you're going to put that into a log line. Like if you were to use this little reference and you put the word when in front of it, when a brilliantly mischievous freshman in high school, whatever it might be, you could just say experiences an inciting incident, because I know a lot of you call it inciting incident. I technically call it a setup event. Experiences an exciting incident, whatever that is. She must, alongside a secondary character, achieve this, whatever this might be, against, or if you keep the logline structural, you could go until this happens, but against an opponent that, changes everything, whatever the moment might be. But you start to see that, hey, I can start my log line directly with a reference to who my character is in like 8 words or less. And it starts the reader's brain out on, here's the type of character. And then the rest of the log line is detailing in some way, in a reference of a moment or 2 or 3, with other characters involved, the plot situation. And that's all you're technically doing with a log line. Type of character and a type of situation. Summaries, 1-page summaries, pitch decks, those are completely different because you can get into a lot more detail. But usually your log line is all there is that an executive has to go with, when they are considering your project. If you just do a general Google search of character descriptors or character attributes, and you can find your own words. You can start making your own list. One of my writers from the retreat, and Ryan can attest to this, has a binder. He brought like a physical binder of printed out character descriptors, character descriptions, and it was like 15 pages or something, where he had just kind of collected this over the years of all these different ways to describe a character in as few words as possible. So I'm not even going to bother sharing this because you can find those words yourself. So C is asking, what's the difference between windows and moments? Good question. So I kind of covered a little bit. You might have asked that question afterward the fact, but a window is just a window into who the person is. Like if we're just standing outside of somebody's house and being really creepy and stalking, we're going to look inside someone's house and we're going to see the type of furniture they have. Is their carpet old and gross, or is it brand new and really fancy? Do they have a grandfather clock? Do they not have any clocks at all? Whatever you see through that window, it starts giving you a little bit of an opinion on who that person is. A moment is quite literally a scene. This, like when I was describing for my comedy adventure, this risk-averse guy has to jump out of an airplane. That would be horrifying for someone who is very, like, to a point of almost like having paralysis, that they are so risk averse. They have to then jump out of an airplane. It's that type of brainstorm place to be in your brain for a brainstorm. The types of moments and scenes, that's a moment list. And then on the other side of the page is a window list, which is just types of shoes, clothes, bedside clock, whether they have one or not. All the different gadgets they might have on their body, if they have tattoos, all those things are windows into who this person is, because we as an audience can then place judgment on who this person is, because we do. When we are introduced to a character, how that character looks, sadly, we are starting to, place some kind of a judgment. Let's see here. So other questions in the comment section. There's a set of books called The Positive Trait Thesaurus, Negative Trait, etc. You can find them on Amazon. Beautiful. Go. That's an amazing comment. And he or she, I'm sorry, only posted that to me. So I will put this to everybody. Yeah, that's awesome. There are a ton of resources. You just kind of have to think about, what do I need in my brainstorming? I need to figure out who the character is. I have to really define my concept. And if you notice, I'm not even getting to structure, because structure is for me just outlining. And I come from a place of 12 sequences from a feature standpoint. And it's really just all, a structural development, et cetera, from an outlining standpoint. And those 12 sequences do still exist in even a half-hour comedy or an hour-long pilot. They're just squeezed together in a much tighter fashion. I'm not going to go too much into how all that works, because I have other webinars and it takes a full hour to go through what every single sequence means. And you can develop from a place of, main character stage of life is first sequence, and you're also presenting arena and what those characters' flaws might be, et cetera, et cetera. In a half-hour comedy, you're probably presenting main character, who that person is, the stage of life, meaning, they were just fired or they're on the verge of a birthday or something, and a setup event or inciting incident, all within one moment. Joey walks into the apartment and he's got a sling, his arm in a sling, his arm's broken. And he says, yeah, my arm is broken. Can you believe it? I have an audition today to be a rock climber. I don't know what I'm going to do. The way he says it is presenting character, flaw, personality, et cetera. We have a stage of life. He has an audition coming up. And the problem, the inciting incident, is I just got a call from my agent. I have a rock climbing audition, and yet I have a broken arm. So you're doing that within a page, and you kind of have to within a half-hour comedy. So the sequence brainstorming, the 12 sequences, and really it's just a general flow of any story. You can find those webinars through the pro tips page if you're a Connect member. If you're not a Connect member, you don't have access to it. But you should be a Connect member. Let's see, can I come up with some other examples for brainstorming? Okay, I'll go into the structure a little bit then. C is working on a limited series, probably 12 episodes. Any suggestions? It's perfect if it's 12 episodes. I don't want to say perfect, but it's as an example in a segue into what I'm going to talk about. If you take a 12 sequence approach to storytelling, there are 3 sequences, and I'm taking a movie approach for now. See, I'll explain what I mean and how you can look at it from a limited series approach. But from a feature standpoint, you have 3 sequences in the first act, 6 sequences in the second act, 3 sequences in the third act. So again, I could go on and on with all this. So I'm trying to keep it relatively specific. Each sequence is a series of scenes. It's not like a sequence, like a car chase sequence. There are multiple scenes in a sequence, usually between 3 and maybe 6 or 7 scenes. The sequences 10 and 11 that begin your third act, usually very short, maybe a scene or 2 between the 2 of them. Point being, you have multiple scenes in a sequence. And there are, generally speaking, this is very formulaic, but generally speaking, certain pieces of information need to be presented every 10 pages. That's kind of where that idea comes from. If you have 12 sequences times 10 pages, you have a 120-page script. Don't write a 120-page script, it's too long. But every 10 pages, you have pieces of information you should be delivering. And if you get to a certain point from a page count standpoint, and you haven't delivered this piece of information, you're probably taking too long. Or if you deliver all the information too quickly, then the audience may not have enough time to connect with the main character, because we aren't spending time in that first sequence, like I was mentioning, main character, flaw, personality, the stage of life, etc. We aren't able to connect to that character enough. We don't know who that person is. We're getting too quickly into plot. So it's a way to just kind of check. It's like a check system, but also you can develop from that point. So if you have all this character work you've just done, you know what your second act situation is going to be. You know the pursuit, you know their goal, both plot-based and emotionally based. All that conceptual work as far as genre expectations, you've done all the voice pressure point stuff. Now you get to a point where like, oh, I think I know the direction of the story. I don't know really exactly what's going to happen, where and when. That's when you get into a structural outlining process. Then you can look at the main points of any story, literally any story, have some kind of a setup event, or as some of you call an inciting incident. They all have a midpoint twist, complication of some kind. They all have a low point where everything fails. And there's all, of course, a resolution and a climax. Those 4, right? It's setup, event, complication, low point, climax. Yeah. Those 4 I call anchor moments or anchor sequences, because sometimes it's more than just one moment that presents an inciting incident or it presents a complication. When Harry Met Sally, which, that process of them sleeping together, it's like a build up to, oh God, don't do this. So there are multiple moments that present the twist, and then Harry's reaction to the fact that, oh my God, we just slept together. So it's a little bit of a drawn out, process of the complication. Nonetheless, those four I call the anchor sequences. So you can look at those first and go, okay, well, if I have this type of character and I know they're pursuing this, what type of setup event could occur that offers the character an opportunity to go pursue this? As they're pursuing it, I can jump to that midpoint complication, even though I don't know exactly what's going to happen between sequences 2 and 6. I can jump to the midpoint and think, well, what's going to really complicate things from an emotional level, because I know all the flaws that this character is dealing with, all the emotional issues that they are too afraid to face up to. What type of thing that I can have happen, for lack of a better way of saying it, that I can show this character is now having to choose a new direction, because that's ultimately what a midpoint complication does. They have to go in a new direction. Things aren't going to be going the same way they were in the prior sequences. Now we have to go in a new direction. But there's an emotional complication. We don't want to forget that. We all hear that term plot twist. And of course, you're going to have a plot twist of some kind. Just because I always reference When Harry Met Sally, but the plot situation twist is the fact that they slept together. The emotional complication is, oh my God, we're friends. We shouldn't have done that. And now I'm reacting from an emotional place. That occurs virtually across the board in any sequential ordered story where you have a midpoint complication that, yes, is changing the plot direction, but there's an emotional reaction, either very positively, girl gets girl or something, and they're like, oh my God, everything's working. We're romantically in love and blah, whatever it might be. But then things fall out and we lead to the low point anyway. Or it's a negative thing, some early failure. And now they have to take a new direction. And then you have the low point, which is the end of your second act in a feature. And then, of course, you have the climax. So you can use those 4 anchor sequences, multiple scenes or just one scene or one moment, that can then start setting you structurally within this basic idea that you've brainstormed. Then you can start filling in the middle, and maybe the midpoint changes. Maybe the low point becomes lower, or maybe you move the low point to the midpoint. So in other words, what the sequence brainstorming allows you to do is work from a non-linear way. It allows you to not have to just start at page 1 and plow yourself through making up things as you go. We're making up things as we go anyway. You might as well see things from a little bit more of a structural order. From a limited series approach, or even a TV first season, whether it's half hour or hour long, if you have 12 sequences and you have 12 episodes, suddenly you're looking at the sequences from each episode. Like episode 1 is main character stage of life, arena, personality, blah, blah, blah. And then the second episode is that huge, new opportunity, second act, or setup event, etc. The third episode is a big introduction to who the secondary character is going to be. That's a little too straightforward and obvious, because you're going to have those moments also happen in each individual episode. And that's why writing TV is so difficult, because you're basically writing an 8 to 12 hour movie, but each episode also follows the sequential order, 1 through 12. And so it's a lot to think about. And even on top of that, you have A story, B story, and sometimes a C story in each episode. And so if you really want to figure out on your own for free, technically, how to write TV, watch any traditional sitcom and just study them, because they all work the same way. And the timestamps are almost always the same as far as when things happen, when A story is presented, when the B story is presented, when the little runner C story is presented. Those timestamps usually happen at the same time. Then you can just kind of extrapolate from that half-hour traditional sitcom and do your own thing. Most sitcoms do this. I'm not going to write a traditional sitcom. I'm going to write, a half-hour comedy that's more serialized, but I can still follow the order of events a little bit, and you can work from that place. An hour long is just expanding that much more. And you have more time in an hour long to spend on some of those more emotional scenes, the non-plot oriented scenes. You can really get into who those characters are. And you're doing that in every episode, but you're also doing it throughout the first season, the second season, third season. And you have to be stringing together A story interweaving with B story and see, so I'm telling you things you already know, but there's more work to do in TV. But if you're writing a limited series, just think of it as a 12-hour movie. And that movie is going to still follow the 12 sequence order of things. Like if you watch any episode that is like the second to last or third to last episode in a season, especially for an hour long, maybe not so much a half-hour comedy, but Game of Thrones, for instance, for every season, I think there were 8 seasons of Game of Thrones. The second to last or third to last episode was always the best one and the most exciting one, because it was the low point. It was the low point of the season. It was when the bad guys win and the good guys are in really rough shape. And then boom, they end the episode. And then you have to come back next week, and then we're going to see how they rally from that, and then how they're then going to lead us to the season finale and that huge resolution. So let's see here. C saying we'll re-listen to this. Yeah. Deeper character studies like the John Lithgow episode of The Crown. John Lithgow and The Crown was so amazing. Go is asking, how do you approach an outline, and how strict are you towards sticking with the outline when creating your draft? Really good question. So I basically just defined how I approach writing an outline. I don't, from the basic formatting level, it doesn't matter. I just write one and then a paragraph that describes the first 10 pages, really is all I'm doing. Eventually you can build out the outline to get much more detailed. And then, sequence 1, here are all the scenes, sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, here's what happens in each scene. That's just a general, again, list making approach. But the question of how strict are you towards sticking with the outline when creating your draft? Not very, I guess, is the really basic kind of dumbed down answer to that. At the very least, you have to be open to changes, because when I'm working with my writers one-on-one, I have them go through outlining for a long time, and they're basically writing the script in the outline. And so a lot of the rewrites we're making and the changes we're applying are done in outline form, because what happens when we get into pages, and I think I've mentioned this in prior webinars, something changes in our brains as screenwriters, because we're now looking at format. We're looking at scene headings and parentheticals and transitions, and how is my dialogue lining up, and are my scene direction lines too long? Do I have big chunk paragraphs, or do I bold this word, or what happens if I italicize? It's like, holy shit, let's not even worry about that. None of that technically matters. And if you've done, well, I should say none of it matters, because those big changes and decisions need to be made in the outline. So that's why it's a little bit of a loaded answer, because hopefully you're using your outline to then help you write the pages. But where I try to motivate my writers, or where to push them, is to make all the decisions in the outline. Eventually you have a 12-page outline, maybe a little longer, where you're getting all the details out with some lines of dialogue in your outline, so that when you are ready to open up Final Draft or whatever screenwriting program you use, you've already written the scene. Now you can focus on, oh, here's the right scene heading, here's the type of location. Do I need a transition? Probably not. You're making those decisions because you've already made the decisions about the scene itself. There are going to be new discoveries you're making in the pages, because sometimes those characters take on a life of their own. They might say something that you didn't necessarily think they would say in that moment. Suddenly that changes a future scene because they're not going to react that way anymore. But you are aware of all of that because of the work in the outline. Okay, we got more questions. How can you get to know your characters when you can't see them interact in scenes? So for one, you can come up with very generic examples. If you have a type, if you have an understanding of what you want this character flaw to be, what they believe in, their personality, put them in everyday life situations. How do they react to the DMV? How might they react to, kind of a grumpy waiter? You just come up with stuff, and eventually, hopefully in your development process, you of course have to develop what the story is, but you're also coming from a place of, well, what does this character actually need? What do they need to learn? What type of situation can I put the character in so that they learn that? It's going to be really hard. It's going to be over the course of an hour and a half to 2 hours, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm glad to see everybody saying that this was helpful. Am I open to connecting on LinkedIn? Absolutely. You can find me there. I'm just Max Timm. I don't check LinkedIn very often, everybody. So if you send me a question, it might be a little while until I reply. But I'm glad this was helpful. It was recorded. It's available for free to basic ISA members for a week, but for Connect members, it'll always be available. So cool. All right. Well, everybody, if you have any questions, you can email me, max@thestoryfarm.org. If you have any questions about the retreats I'm going to be putting on in the future year, if you want to work with me one-on-one, and then of course those writing groups that I have Thursday nights, Friday mornings, $50 a month. It's going to be very workshoppy. We're going to be working through a lot of stuff if you need it, so let me know and we'll make it happen. All right, everybody, have a safe and happy Halloween if you're celebrating. Don't eat too much candy, but if you do, oh well. I'll see you in a month. All right, bye.